we're in a situation where, and we've reestablished direct contact with China after that. Remember the balloon, quote unquote, going down, and all of a sudden things came to an end? Well, we set up a new mechanism. There's a direct line between Xi and me, and our military has direct access to one another, and they contact one another when we have problems.
President, I'm not sure you answered on whether you would be ready to go deal with Putin and Xi 2 or 3 years from now.
I'm ready to deal with them now and 3 years from now.
Okay, so a mechanism was just set up now about the presidents of China and U.S. speaking to each other. A mechanism was just set up recently for the militaries. I mean, that was President Biden speaking last night at the NATO press conference. The 32 allies declared that China is a, quote, decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine and demanded that it halt shipments of weapons and technology to Russia, although they did not announce sanctions. No sanctions announced, no next steps announced. China is denying the accusation. China is calling it slanderous and provocative. Joining me now is Hudson Institute Senior Fellow, Atlas Organization founder, and the author of The Decisive Decade, Jonathan D.T. Ward. Jonathan, thanks very much for being here. What is your reaction to the arrangement between the U.S. and China in terms of understanding what the other is doing? I mean, the president there is saying, well, I guess he's suggesting a surveillance balloon is not going to happen again because the militaries are talking, which is completely absurd.
Look, military-to-military ties is normal. The Chinese shut that off for a while. That's been reconstituted. So I think that's something you essentially need with a major adversary. We even had that with the Soviet Union. So that's probably back to normal. And it was usually China that was pushing that away. So, you know, the U.S. has always had an interest in having an open line with them, regardless of the fact that they are our major adversary.
Right, but having an open line would not have stopped a Chinese surveillance balloon. China was going to send that surveillance balloon to America regardless. They weren't going to call up Joe Biden and say, hey, we're sending a surveillance balloon now. I mean, the whole thing is so stupid.
Well, no, I mean, an open line with an enemy doesn't change the enemy's actions.
Right.
So I don't think that's I mean, that's not necessarily in the realm of the broader strategic competition. But let's go to the NATO summit, Maria, because what actually happened, I think, is extremely important. I mean, this is a milestone, probably really a sea change in the international political picture here, because you have 32 NATO states, which is half of the world economy, now calling out the People's Republic of China as the decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. So this has taken time. And as you know, I've told your audience from the very moment of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that China was backing Putin. I mean, it was very clear from the beginning that, you know, they did this right after the Olympics in Beijing and the No Limits Partnership. And Beijing has backed this war from the beginning. But now you have NATO, which alone is half of the world economy, saying, you know, calling China out and seeing the Russia-China axis for what it is. So even though this hasn't yet led to alliance-wide sanctions, I think we are on track to work as an alliance system, you know, as the alliance that won the Cold War, the most important alliance there is, to deal with Russia and China ultimately. So this is a change that I don't think is going to go backwards. And, you know, we can pave the way to defeat both of these places. And it's going to come down to economic power. But I think to see Europe and the United States very united. And, you know, I did go to some things in Washington this week, and I think the feeling and the spirit of it is very strong. So the Western alliance is going to be fundamental, as I've written in both of my books, to defeating the long-term challenge from China and its axis of hangers-on, including Russia. So I think this has been a very positive development to see that kind of unity, which we haven't seen in the free world in a very long time, if at all, on the problem of China.
Yeah, and you've written this about having that need to even increase during this decade, the decisive decade. But I want to get your take on what's going on in terms of the activity. Multiple Chinese warships have been spotted off of the coast of Alaska. That happened on Wednesday, according to the U.S. Coast Guard. The 4 ships seen on Saturday and Sunday in international waters, but inside the U.S. exclusive economic zone. That zone extends 200 miles from the shore. A U.S. Coast Guard commander said that the ships operated in accordance with international rules and norms. And China stated that the vessels were off the Alaskan coast for, quote, freedom of navigation operations. I mean, is this an intimidation tactic, Jonathan? Taiwan is also still under threat, as more than 60 Chinese warplanes flew near Taiwan yesterday. They say they were doing military drills with their warships in the Pacific, Jonathan.
Well, sure. I mean, look, China's, I think, poking us in the eye here a little bit by calling it freedom of navigation operations. I mean, the U.S. runs freedom of navigation operations on a regular basis through the Taiwan Strait in the South China Sea. But as you know, those who understand this point out, I mean, that's to contest China's claims of the entirety of the South China Sea. So when we're doing freedom of navigation operations, it's to push back against unlawful claims by this totalitarian power. And I think they're just trying to harass us in the same way. I mean, sending ships around the Bering Sea and near the Aleutian Islands. And you know, we saw a Russia-China flotilla last year doing this up near Alaska. And, you know, we're going to see a lot more of this, I think. I mean, China now has a blue water navy, the largest navy in the world by tonnage. I mean, they can outproduce us 200 to 1 in terms of shipbuilding. So they targeted the shipbuilding industry and went ahead and became essentially the #1 producer. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this sort of thing. But we're going to have to invest in a much more significant counterpoint. And at this point, you know, Xi Jinping, as you know, has been telling the world for quite some time he's preparing for war in the Pacific. And the U.S. still has some pretty impressive options to deter this. One thing that really counts, I think, is Replicator in the Pentagon. This initiative to field thousands and thousands of drones in all domains could make it a real nightmare for Xi Jinping. Paparo is calling it, Admiral Paparo of Indo-Pacific Command is calling it hellscape, is the concept to use you know, drones and other attritable systems against China in the Taiwan Strait should they decide to go against us. But bottom line, there's a lot we can do to change the military balance and to make up for some of the shortfalls that we've experienced over the past 10 years. But we're going to have to invest much more heavily in defense. We're going to need Europe to invest much more heavily in its own security, and they're starting to do that. We've seen that those numbers come up a lot. They probably need to go higher. And then our alliance system in Asia, I think, is getting closer and closer and more focused on this problem. So I think the bottom line is we're starting to see, you know, a real sort of halcyon period for the U.S. alliance system, and investment is going to need to match that. And then we're going to need to start playing economic hardball with China and all of its hangers-on.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you about, because House Speaker Mike Johnson said that he's aiming to pass, quote unquote, major legislation to combat what he calls the China-led axis. And he said this will happen before the end of the year. Watch this.
The House will be voting on a series of bills to empower the next administration to hit our enemies' economies on day one. We will build our sanctions package, punish the Chinese military firms that provide material support to Russia and Iran, and we'll consider options to restrict outbound investments in China. Our goal is to have a significant package of China-related legislation signed into law by the end of this year in this Congress, featuring these priorities and many more, and we'll work aggressively toward that package.
Jonathan, your latest op-ed is on Fox Digital right now, and it's titled, "Want a Stable World? Disengage from the Chinese Economy." You write, decades of wishful thinking that economic integration between China and the West would create international stability have failed. I'd like you to tell us more about that. And I also would like your take on whether or not this new China bill that Mike Johnson is talking about, do you think that will lead to Chinese companies on the U.S. exchanges getting delisted? I just did a whole special on this, as you know, Underwriting the Enemy, talking about the many Chinese companies that are trading right now on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. They do not follow the same accounting rules that American companies or any other companies follow. And in fact, China is the only country that I have found that has such an allowance to have their companies trade on our exchanges, the deepest and most most liquid capital markets in the world. So tell us more.
Sure, and I think Mike Johnson's speech was great. I mean, we hosted him at Hudson Institute, and you know, he's saying exactly the right thing, and that's the direction we need to go. So I think having that sort of broader strategic vision coming out of Congress, which you know builds on the work of the House Select Committee, but is going further. I mean, Congress is really engaged with this issue, and you know what I've advocated for in my op-ed with Robert Pittenger, and you know really across the board in most of my work is, you know, we have this massive economic toolkit that we can use. The rise of China continues to depend on the U.S. and on our allies, and that's why this NATO meeting was so important. U.S. is 25% of the world economy. But together with NATO, we're 50%. I mean, that alone is enough to start, putting an end to the geopolitical rise of China. So yes, I mean, we have to get their companies off our exchanges. There's a giant threat surface if you look at the Chinese 5-year plans and other strategies. I mean, there's a whole lot of targetable entities, and we can stop funding that. We can stop buying, things that they're producing in strategic industries, and we can cut off the key technologies, and we can do the latter part across the entire alliance system.
All right, we've got breaking news right now. Jonathan, it's always good to see you. Thank you. You can catch my special, Underwriting the Enemy, which is streaming right now on Fox Nation. Jonathan, we will see you soon.